I wanted to talk about a common problem that comes up with filmmakers at every stage of the production, especially when you're making a film yourself. It's procrastination. When you've got that blank canvas, it's really hard to know where to start, how to start, just that initial push into creating a work of art of any kind. It can be incredibly just overwhelming when you first start because where do you begin? How do you start? That initial motivation, the push to get started, is the hardest part of any work of art. There's also these self-created imaginary walls that you invent to stop yourself from starting, like the idea that, well, I have to be in a specific creative mood in order to do this. Most artists have that feeling of creativity when they're in the thick of doing it. So when you go to create something new, you invent these invisible walls to stop you from starting, going, it's like, well, I'm not in that exact creative headspace, so I can't really start yet. I know for myself and anecdotally with other artists like stand-up comedians, musicians, painters, and other people I've known, we always have this mindset that, well, we can't start until we're in that creative mindset, and we have to have like a whole day or a whole week set aside to be able to do art. And if anything happens in that day, like if you have to run an errand or something, well, I can't be creative, and I got to go to the store at 3 p.m. or I've got a doctor's appointment at 2, so I can't start being creative. I don't have the whole day set aside. And it's these excuses, these procrastinations we invent to be an excuse why we're not creating art. Like there's this idea that, well, you can't be creative for like 2 hours a night. Like you set aside 2 hours a night. Like artists are always procrastinating. They're always looking to push away the act of creating because it's just so daunting when you haven't started yet. Like every idea is perfect until you actually start to make it. And when you actually start, it's never going to meet that idealistic version we put in our heads. Once you start making it, it starts to become real. People can start to judge it. People can tell you it's not good. And then that becomes the reason you don't actually want to make it, because the art is then just an idea in your head and it's perfect, and it can stay perfect as long as you never make it. And that's a terrible way to treat your art. When it comes to filmmaking, at the beginning, there's writer's block. There's that blank page you're staring at and that cursor blinking at you like it's taunting you, laughing at you for not writing. Then there's the next stage, the shoot. Man, getting a ton of people together, organizing it and doing the shoot, that is so much stress and energy and organization. And there's the panic and the nervousness and stress of not knowing, are they going to show up? Is it going to work? Even if they do, is it going to turn out as well as it is in my head? I don't know. So then you want to procrastinate the actual shoot too. And the slightest hint, it's like, oh, the first person canceled, we don't have to do it. Whew. Now the idea is still perfect in my head. But then there's the editing stage, which is admittedly my favorite stage of filmmaking. When you don't have an actual deadline, like if you're not in one of those timed filmmaking competitions, or there's not an exact film festival submission deadline date, when you have that, again, wide open, no one's making me finish this film, the editing becomes so pushed to the side because you have to find that motivation to start. And I've got another metaphor. When you're looking at all of that raw, unedited footage and you haven't started editing, that is like looking at a hill that you have to climb. And as you look at that hill, you're like, oh man, that's a lot of work. And then you just don't do it. And if there's no deadline and no one's making you, it just doesn't get done. Well, I invented a trick for myself that helps me get through that. So what I do is I take the role of assistant editor on my own project that I'm about to edit. That's the non-creative work. That's, okay, let's start a project. let's open the software. Let's start a project. Let's bring in the footage. Okay, the first thing I can do if I'm not feeling creative at all, it's like, well, let's get the grunt work done. Let's take the footage, start putting it all in a timeline, and start chopping out everything before action and everything after cut. Okay, so I've lopped off footage, and I do that for every shot. And just by doing that alone, there's the math. I went from like 6 hours of footage down to about 4 hours and 15 minutes of footage. That alone means there's less to do. If you look at the metaphor, that means I'm about 25% up the way of the hill. But what I also find happens is I'm able to actually trick myself. I sat down to start doing this work. Like, let's say, what happens is like I set aside 2 hours in the day to do grunt work because I don't have, I have my mind as I have to have the whole day to be creative. Well, it's like, okay, well, if I got these 2-3 hours before I have to go to the doctor's appointment, let's do the organizational work. I start doing the grunt work. Once you start going through the takes, you start seeing what's going on. You start getting creative ideas. You start thinking, well, that's going to edit perfect with that take I saw like 5 minutes ago. And you start thinking, and then maybe you start editing, and then next thing you know, the creative juices are flowing. You're actually getting into that creative mindset when you weren't there when you decided to sit down and do grunt work. So it's like lighting a match and sparking that creative fire inside of yourself. Even when you weren't in the mood, it helps get you in the mood. Well, even on the occasions where that doesn't happen, where you don't actually get creative, you still did all the grunt work that set your project up for when you are feeling creative, when you do have a whole day set aside for editing. There's now less work to be done. You're now 25, 30% up that hill. So suddenly, it's no longer feeling like you're starting from nothing. You've got some work done. It's less daunting. It's less intimidating to start editing because you've already started doing some of the work. And I mean, this may not work for everybody, but it definitely works with me a lot. Once you get done with the grunt work of setting up sequences, renaming stuff, selecting takes, chopping off all the parts of the footage you don't need, you've set yourself up to be creative. There's now nothing left but the fun part of editing, of just putting it together. So just by doing these simple steps, you've set yourself up to succeed. You've set yourself up just to be creative. So using the hill metaphor, you want to get to the point where you've done enough work to where you're going up over the hill and you get to the top, and then momentum, once you've got like a rough cut, the momentum takes you the rest of the way down the hill to the finish line, because at that point, everything is just the fun part. Everything is the creative part, and you've got something to work with, and it's no longer this chore you have to do. It's the fun part that you look forward to doing for the creative aspect of editing a film. Very similar with writing, although I would never call myself an actual writer per se. With writing, there's something very similar to where I find, well, if you're staring at that blank page, what you can do is you can start by writing a summary. And then you start writing more details of each scene. And I find that by the time I get done with that, I'm writing out dialogue that's occurring in my head. And the next thing you know, you've got 40, 50% of a script written just because you forced yourself to start writing an outline. So there's this technique can be applied to all levels of the creative process. The hardest part is just starting. Typing those first words is the hardest part. And once you start doing it, the rest starts to get easier and easier as you go. Everything I've just said is entirely subjective. I'm telling you what has worked for me. I have no idea if it'll work for you, and you won't know until you actually try it. So it's just something I can recommend you try to see if it helps you break through that procrastination. But what about you? What about you guys? What do you do to break through procrastination when it comes to writing and editing on a film? Tell me in the comments below. I'd love to find out other ideas and maybe try something else for myself. And other people can benefit from how you have figured out how to get past that procrastination.